Okay, friends, who is ready to dye? Have you got all of your fabric folded and bound and ready to go? The first step that I want to show you that's really important, unforgettable when it comes to your dyeing, is that the fabric has to be wet before it goes into the indigo dye vat. This is why I think it's nice to have a bucket or a bowl of regular water on hand. I like to put on my gloves before I dip into even the plain water because it's really hard to get wet hands into dry gloves. So once you have your bound pieces ready to go, they first need to go into plain water. Indigo is sort of a lazy dye, but it is liquid. Liquid is going to flow to wherever there's dryness. And so what we want to do in the case of our patterns is make sure that the pattern is all the way saturated, so that when we dip our fabric into the indigo vat, there isn't anywhere extra inside the pattern that we've bound up for the indigo to flow. If it's dry, it will flow all the way to the center and it won't leave any beautiful white resist. When it's wet, all of that center is already saturated with liquid, with plain water, and so the indigo, because it's kind of lazy, doesn't try to get in there, okay? So we want to make sure all of our pieces are good and wet. They don't have to be sopping wet, but they need to be wet enough that there's no dryness on the inside of our patterns. Once you've got all of your pieces ready to go, then you can open up your dye vat. You should have a really beautiful oil slick on the top of your vat. It's so fun. This next part just makes me giddy every time. The technique for dyeing your fabric is super simple. You're going to dip and hold it. I want to show you an example with this where I hold onto the wooden blocks. Where my fingers are is just fine because I'm holding onto the wood. If I dip and hold this one and I hold it in the same place the whole time, I've created a clamp resist with my fingers. So when I'm not holding onto the wood itself, I want to put it in and then move it around a little bit gently with my fingers, even if it's just with one hand, so that my fingers don't create a resist, so that there's actual space for the dye to get on all of the edges, which is what we're hoping for. So once you've got your pieces and you're ready to go, you're just going to slowly dip them into the dye. Again, we're not agitating it. We're trying not to add extra oxygen by shaking it around or by mixing it or messing with it. We just want to simply hold it in place. You can gently move your fingers if they are going to form that kind of a clamp resist. We don't want that to happen. And then after about 10, maybe 50, this is like washing your hands, maybe like a happy birthday song in your head, then you're able to pull your pieces out. Check them out. This is what naked indigo looks like, and right before your eyes, it will start to oxidize in the air as it binds onto all of that oxygen. This, my friends, is why you have a tablecloth. Okay, we're gonna go in with my supernova and our other resist. Once the fabric is out on the table in the air, you can just let it chill. This is the time that it needs to oxidize. That means it's going to start grabbing onto all of that oxygen, and it will happen before your eyes. You can watch it turn from the white indigo, which is actually more of a beautiful fluorescent green color, to the true blue indigo that we know and love. As soon as each of your pieces has been dipped one time in the dye vat, then it needs to oxidize. When you put it on the table, especially if it has a plastic covering like this, at some point when it gets pretty dark blue, you want to check the bottom and you'll see that because it has been starved of oxygen on the bottom side, that this still has a lot of oxidizing to do. So you want to just flip them after, 5 or 10 minutes so that you can make sure that all of those bright green places oxidize out. There we go. This is also a great time to head off and give yourself a snack. You can carefully take off your gloves and just go hang out somewhere. It's going to be about 10-15 minutes until these pieces are ready to go back in the dye vat. Now this is something unique about indigo dye. Time or duration in the dye vat doesn't make a difference past about 30 seconds. It is the frequency of dips that adds to the coloration. So you dip dye your piece one time and you're going to get a nice beautiful light blue. Dip it and then let it oxidize and then dip it again, you're going to get a little bit darker blue. When you dip it and oxidize and dip it and oxidize and go back in over and over, each time you get a shade darker on your blues. So for example, most of the pieces that I do have usually been dipped 2 to 3 times. This piece over here was dipped 4 times. You can see the difference in the blue color that happens the further that you dip it. This is also where we can talk about the dip dye technique. Because of the way that each dip creates a different level of color in your fabric, dip dyeing is a really fun way to make a variation without actually binding the fabric at all. In this particular case, you don't want your fabric to be wet when you get started because you're not creating a resist pattern. You're going to dip it just up to the level that you want your first layer of blue to be. And because my gloves had dye on them, I'm going to just not use them because I don't want to have my gloved dye affect the top of my fabric. So we're gonna let this section go in the dye for, our 10-15 seconds. And then when we pull it out, the next time we dip it, after it oxidizes, we're going to leave some space. And then the next time we're gonna leave a little more space. And that is how we get our gradation in the dip dye pattern. I'm gonna let these hang out for a little while and finish oxidizing, and then I'm gonna dip them again a couple times. Meet me in the next lesson so I can tell you about how to rinse them out when all of your dips have finished.